Hi everyone, welcome back to minerva-tutors-tv, and today's lesson, which is all about volcanoes and the massive forces that bring them into being. Our guide on this geological journey will be our Chief Science Tutor Jack, who many of you will know from previous lessons in previous weeks. In the second half of the lesson, Jack will be showing you how to build a model volcano, and if you've got everything on the equipment list that we sent out earlier, and an adult to supervise and help you, then you can build your own alongside him. If you haven't got everything you need, don't worry, we'll send out the list and all the instructions in the email after the lesson, so you can do it in your own time. We'll have time to ask Jack some questions towards the end of the lesson, so if things occur to you while you're listening, do keep a note of them, jot them down, and as we get towards the Q&A, Jack will remind you that you can write in the chat on the Zoom call, and then we'll ask him some of your questions. He's always brilliant at answering, so I do encourage you to do that. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'm going to hand over to Jack.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lawrence. As you said, today we're going to be looking at making a volcano and sort of talking about how volcanoes are made in real life as well. I hope you're all well today and excited for the lesson. But before we get started, we just want to know what a volcano is, basically. And when we think of volcanoes, when you think of a volcano, you think of something that looks a little bit like this. It's erupting, it's exciting, it's on fire, it's explosive. But most of the time, volcanoes, you wouldn't be able to tell too much of a difference between a volcano and a normal mountain, because a volcano is just sort of a mountain that opens up at the top. And when it's not erupting, you have to go quite far deep down into the Earth's crust to find the lava or the molten rock. And that's what lava is. It's molten rock. But we're not going to call it lava this lesson. We'll call it lava next lesson when we're looking more at the eruption side of it, because lava is when it's come out the top of the volcano. And when it's down in the Earth's crust, down deep in the volcano, we call it magma. So I'm going to keep referring to what we commonly know as lava, like you can see here, as magma, but it's really just really, really hot rock that's a liquid form like lava, but deep in the Earth's crust. So to talk a bit more about how volcanoes themselves are formed, they're formed from the Earth. So we need to know about the layers of the Earth and how we're getting the magma for the volcano and how we're getting the volcanoes being formed. So the layers of the Earth can be shown in a 3D. If we were to take the Earth and sort of cut it directly down the middle and pull out each individual layer, we get something that looks a bit like this here. So if starting from the middle, in the very, very middle here, we've got the inner core of the Earth. This is directly in the center of the Earth, and it's the hottest part. It's about 5,000 to 6,000 degrees Celsius. So very, very, very hot. To give you an idea of the temperatures, that is, it's about 300 times as hot as the room you're currently in now. So very, very hot. In there, you turn to dust instantly. It's that hot. It's a solid. Oddly, we think of a lot of the Earth as being filled with magma, but the core itself, the inner core, is a solid. It's a solid made up of iron and nickel. And you would think at those temperatures, the iron and nickel would melt. But because there's so much pressure pushing down on them from gravity, remember from a few weeks ago when we were talking about the rockets, gravity being the force that pulls everyone down to Earth, that force is pulling everything towards the center of the Earth. So right in the center of the Earth, there's lots of gravity and lots of pressure pressing onto this iron and nickel, keeping it in a solid form. So although it's very, very hot, it's still a solid. And that's sort of why it remains a solid. So that's the inner core. If we go along a layer, we have the outer core, which is still this sort of yellowy, almost hot white color, because it's still very, very hot. It's still, it's about 4,000 to 6,000 degrees C, so a little bit cooler, but or a little bit cooler on average, but still very, very hot. It's made up of nickel and iron again, but it's also made up of sulfur and oxygen. So sulfur and oxygen, nickel and iron, and they're all in the liquid form because there's not as much pressure this time, so the hot temperatures can melt the things that are in the outer core are made up of in the outer core. Then we've got the mantle, which is shown here. We can split the mantle into the lower mantle and the upper mantle. So the lower mantle first is the one next to the outer core. So it's the hottest part of the mantle. It's about 3,000 degrees Celsius. It's made up, again, that's a liquid, so it can move around, it can flow. It's made up of molten rock, iron, oxygen, silicone, magnesium, aluminium. So lots of metals in there that it's made up of, and all these molten metals in the lower mantle. Again, it's hot enough to melt, but there's not enough pressure to make it a solid, so it's a liquid. The same with the outer core, the outer mantle, or the upper mantle. That's the mantle that is close, or the parts of the mantle that is closest to the crust. And this is a mix between a solid and a liquid. And the reason for that is as the upper mantle gets closer to the crust, it can start to solidify because it gets cooler and cooler and cooler. So when it's closer to the crust, it tends to be cooler temperatures. And the temperature range of the upper mantle is anywhere between 1,400 and 3,000 degrees C. So it's still very, very hot. But we can have the solid and the liquid forms in the upper mantle. Yeah, so that's the inside layers. And then you can see on the outside layer, the most important layer, because it's the one that we live on, is the crust. Now the crust itself is the sort of thinnest of all the layers. And on here you can see, especially sort of at the top there, it's very, very, very thin compared to the other ones, especially compared to the mantle, which looks a lot thicker. But just to give you an idea, it's about, at its deepest, it's about 36 kilometers deep. So it's still 36 kilometers, a long way. That's a long way to be digging down. So it's still quite deep and still quite thick, and it's protecting us from these inner hotter layers here. And it means that on the surface, the average temperature of the crust is about 22 degrees Celsius. So a good room temperature, a nice temperature, not anything that's gonna harm us. It's a solid, of course, because we need to be able to build on it. We need to be able to live on it. We're stood on the crust right now. Hopefully you are, or sat on the crust in some sort of way. Hopefully you're not floating. But the crust itself needs to be a solid so that we can live on it. It's made up of oxygen, granite, and iron, mainly. Granite is like a really, really hard rock. Oxygen, when we're talking about oxygen, we're not talking about the oxygen in the air that's making up the crust. It's solid oxygen that has formed with other metals like gold, like silver, like iron, like nickel, and it's formed and made the Earth's crust itself. Like we've said before, it's the thinnest layer, and we've actually tried to dig really deep down into it. And the deepest we've ever dug down into the crust to try and get to the mantle is something called the Kola super deep borehole. And the Kola super deep borehole is the furthest we've ever dug. This is a good representation. On this graph, it's shown as this yellow line. So you've got the crust being the grey area, and down here you've got the mantle being the red area. So you can see we've not really got anywhere close to the mantle before by digging down. We've actually only got about a third of the way with this Kola super deep borehole, and it itself was 12,262 meters deep. And at that point, we then had to stop digging because the drill was getting too hot, because it was getting closer and closer to the mantle. So obviously temperatures were getting hotter and hotter and hotter. The drill would just start melting as it was digging. So we couldn't dig any further than this into the crust. And just to give you an idea of how thin the crust is compared to the rest of the Earth, this really, really deep hole that we've dug into the crust is only 0.002%. That's 0.002% of the way to the center of the Earth. So a tiny, tiny amount. That just gives you a good scale of how huge the Earth itself is. And the hole itself, to get even this far, it took 24 years for them to dig that. With really advanced drills that were drilling very, very quickly. So again, that's another good idea as to how deep this hole is, and then even how much bigger the Earth as a whole is, and how difficult it would be to get through this first layer, this crust layer. So the crust itself isn't made up of one continuous piece. It actually kind of fits together a bit like a jigsaw. So this is a good 3D image of it. So the crust, we can see, it's got all the countries on it, it's got all the oceans on it, things like that. It's separated into these different bits. And this is a sort of obviously not a real image. It's where we've separated the pieces so we can see the lines between them. On a 2D image, it looks something like this. So you can see again, it's split. The Earth, or the crust, in this case shown on a map, is split into several jigsaw pieces. Now, these are what we call tectonic plates, and they can move around, which is odd because we don't feel them moving around. In fact, they only move about 2 centimeters every year. So it's a very, very small amount. But the reason they move about is because they're all made up of crust. Below that, we've got the mantle, the liquid mantle, and the crust pieces, the crust tectonic plate jigsaw pieces, all fit, all sort of float and fit on top of the mantle. So they're floating around, and as the mantle's moving underneath, because it's a liquid, it's moving these tectonic plates. And so when they're moving, they're rubbing up against each other and slightly moving apart. Some might be slightly moving more closer together. Again, we don't feel it because it's a very, very small amount per year, but they are moving, and the Earth's map and geography is constantly changing because of this. Now, back to volcanoes. So how volcanoes are formed? Well, you will normally find most of the Earth's volcanoes on the lines, these red lines that you can see here. So this is the gaps between the tectonic plates, or the boundaries between the tectonic plates where they're rubbing against each other. And volcanoes can be formed from tectonic plates in 2 ways. So the 2 ways that volcanoes can be formed are these first 2 here, the divergent way or the convergent way. So divergent way is when plates end up moving away from each other. And when they're moving away from each other, it leaves a gap for magma, for magma from the mantle and the mantle to rise up. And when it rises through that gap, it creates sort of a mound-like shape or a volcano. The other way is the convergent way, and that's the opposite. So when the plates, the tectonic plates, are moving towards each other, sometimes one can slide under the other and push one of the plates up, again forming a mound on top, like a volcano-like structure. We can also have another type of tectonic plate movement, and that would be the transforming movement, or the transform movement. That's when they move side to side. When this happens, we don't get a volcano, but we can sometimes get earthquakes. And it's kind of because of the friction between the plates. And we can demonstrate this with our hands. If you rub your hands together, what you'll feel is you'll feel them getting warmer and warmer and warmer. As they're getting warmer and warmer and warmer, this is because of the friction between your hands. The hands are quite rough, or they might feel smooth, but generally our hands are quite bumpy. And it's the same with plates. So when they're moving against each other, it's creating excess energy from these bumps pushing against each other each time, the same on the plates. When we're rubbing our hands together, that excess energy turns into heat. When plates are rubbing together, it doesn't always turn into heat, but it can turn into earthquakes as the vibrations created by the movement of the plates move through the plates and cause earthquakes in that land, or that section. So you can see, if we go back to this map, a lot of the areas that experience a lot of earthquakes or commonly get earthquakes, sort of like the west coast of the United States up there, they're on these tectonic plate boundaries because that's where the earthquakes are originating from. So good stuff there. So yeah, that's how we can sort of form volcanoes, through mainly these 2 divergent and convergent movements of tectonic plates. So once a volcano is formed, we need to know a little bit about the structure of the volcano. So here we've got a very simple volcano diagram with a couple of labels, and then I'll talk you through some of them now. And the main one we want to look at, where all the action's happening, is the main vent. So the main vent runs up and down the volcano, right down to the bottom where we'd have a magma chamber. Or if it goes deep enough, this main vent, it may even go straight through to the mantle. But often we've got a magma chamber at the base of the volcano that is full of this magma, this hot molten rock that will eventually, when the volcano erupts, pour out the top and become lava. So the main vent is the key thing that makes it a volcano. We can also have secondary vents that sort of branch off the main vent like a tree. And we can have secondary sort of craters here, because at the very top we've got a crater, which is like craters on the moon. But when we mean craters in science, we're just talking about a dip in some landform. So on the moon, we've got a dip in the moon, which we call a crater. In a volcano, we've got a dip in the top, which we call a crater. So we can have the main crater at the top and secondary craters wherever we've got these secondary vents coming from. That's what we've got there. We can also have, as well, secondary cones occasionally, and that would just be sort of a cone coming off the main cone. So the main cone of the volcano is the volcano shape. you might have little cones coming off the side of it. And when you're making your volcano, you might want to add little cones. And we'll talk about how we can do that when we go on to making them in just a minute. That's what we've got there. So then you'll see some of the things that are produced by this volcano. We've got ash, steam, and gas. You can also have volcanic bombs be produced. Volcanic bombs are just large materials thrown out by the eruption. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that next week when we talk more about eruptions and the explosion side of volcanoes. But yeah, that's the main structure. And you'll see that all volcano types that we're about to look at should have some of these things that we've just spoken about then. So the first type of volcano that we can look to make today, and the first type that there is a cinder cone volcano. Now, a cinder cone volcano, like the name, is cone shaped. Big clue there. It's just basically an upside down ice cream cone with the top chopped off. So we have that crater in the top. Commonly, cinder cone volcanoes will only have one vent. So right from the magma chamber to the crater, there'll only be one vent and they won't branch off into secondary vents. We also know how these types of volcanoes are made. So they're made by fragments of rock that are explosively blown into the air, and they cool in the air and sort of form this cone-like shape around the vent and build up and build up and build up as they cool. So obviously when the fragments are being blown into the air, they'll be very, very hot, but then they'll start to cool and form the sides of the volcano. So that's the first type, a cinder cone volcano. The second type is my favorite type. It's the most explosive type, the most exciting type, a composite volcano. So a lot of you might want to choose to make a composite volcano today. And if you want to make one of those, you're going to need very, very steep sides. Composite volcanoes always have steep sides, and they tend to be larger than cinder cone volcanoes and the other types of volcanoes we'll look at as well. So the biggest, the most explosive volcanoes are composite volcanoes. They tend to have multiple vents as well. So they can have eruptions from the side of the volcanoes, but the main eruption will still happen at the crater at the top. And like we say, they tend to force the magma up through the vent at very, very high pressures. So they're very, very violent volcanoes, a very violent type of volcanoes. Some of you might like to make a bit more of a relaxed type of volcano, and that would be a shield volcano. So you can see this one, compared to the last one, that was very steep compared to this shield volcano. We've got a very, very flat volcano. And the reason why we have sort of these gentle slopes on either side of this shield volcano is because the lava that comes out of a shield volcano is very, very runny. So it gets to go a long, long distance before it cools and solidifies, meaning that we get this more gentle slope and we don't really have a drop off because this runny lava is running downhill and extending out the volcano on both sides there. They're not as explosive because we've got this more runny type of lava, but they do lead to some of the largest volcanoes in the world. So Mauna Loa in Hawaii is the largest volcano in the world, and it's a shield volcano type because they just expand huge kilometers or large distances of land, the shield volcano. So that's the third type. The fourth and final type of volcano we're looking at today is a lava dome volcano. Often these ones look quite cool, as you can see with this one here as well. But basically they are an opposite to a shield volcano. They don't have runny lava, they have really thick lava that comes out of it. And what that leads to is it sort of builds up around the vent very steeply in like a mound-like shape. So that's what we've got here. We've kind of got a mound. It's not as tall as a composite volcano, or often not as tall as a cinder cone volcano either. Just a mound, and that's why it's called a lava dome. You often get this sort of dome-like shape there. And again, they've got quite steep sides. So if you want to make a lava dome volcano, you want steep sides and a dome-like shape there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put that into practice, and I'm going to teach you how to make your own volcano. So if you've got the stuff to make your volcano, you can do it along with us. If not, don't worry, you'll have plenty of time later this week and at the weekend as well to prepare your volcano so that we can erupt it next week and talk through that as well. So what you'll need to start off, and I'm just going to tilt the camera down so you can see the table in front of me. Here's the first thing we'll need is a bottle. And it can be, I'm using a glass bottle here, but it could be a plastic bottle, and it can be any size. A good size would be sort of a 330 milliliter one, like a normal Coke bottle or a Sprite bottle or anything along those lines. But you can use a big one. You'll just need more ingredients next time when you're exploding it. And you'll also need a cardboard base. So here, what I've done to make my cardboard base, you can just use a piece of cardboard, but I tried to try and keep mine a bit, to try and keep mine in one area. I've folded up the sides a bit so that I've got sort of, it almost is, it's basically half a cereal box. I've chopped the cereal box in half, folded up the sides, and we've got a good base here. So what we want to do then is we want to take our bottle and take our base, and we want to stick our bottle in the middle of our base, like so. And you want it roughly in the middle. Again, it doesn't matter if it's off to one side or off to another side, but roughly in the middle there. What we're going to do then is tape it in place. And this is just to initially secure the bottle in place, make sure it's not going to slide around too much. So I'm going to take a few strips of tape, like so. So I've got quite a long strip of tape here. And I'm just going to run it down the side of my bottle and over the top, but making sure and then sticking it to the base at the other end to the top. So you can kind of see it's running diagonal down here into the corner of the box or the base down there. And you'll do this about 4 times. 4 times should be enough to sort of secure it. I've got another piece of tape. I'm going to do the other side, and I'm going to kind of do 4 points like a compass: north, south, east, and west of my bottle, just to secure it in place. Like so. And again, you kind of want to make sure you're not taping over the hole at the top. It's not too much of a problem if you do, because you can always sort of poke through it. But generally, you don't want to block it, so you know where the hole is. So when we've got our volcano, we have a good crater at the top. So we've got those 2 in place. I'm just going to do the other 2. Again, for those of you following along at home, just make sure it's nice and secure. For those of you who aren't, make a mental note of what you're doing, and then it'll be easier to follow through the instructions afterwards, like so. And you can also see what works well on mine as I'm going through it and what doesn't, and maybe you can improve yours and make it better than mine as you're going through. So it's also an advantage to not be following along. But those of you who are, hopefully I'll be doing it before you, so you'll be able to see my mistakes as I go through it. So again, I've done all 4 corners there. I tried to make sure the top is, we can still have that crater at the top, and we should find that my bottle is more securely in place now. It still wobbles a bit, but that will get better as we add the next stage. It's just to hold it in that one place to start off with. So the next stage, what you'll need is there's a couple of options that we can use for this. So the first option, and the one I'm using at the moment, is PVA glue. And what I've done with this PVA glue is I've mixed it in with some water. I've diluted it, and I've diluted it by putting 1 part PVA glue in. So that would ended up being about a tablespoon's worth of PVA glue, and 6 parts water, so 6 tablespoons of water. And I've created sort of a paper mache mix that I've just stirred together. Now you don't have to do this with PVA glue. You can do this with flour and water. Again, with the flour, you'll want 1 part flour to 6 parts water. You can also, if you've not got either of those ingredients, use sugar and water. Again, you might want to use 2 parts sugar, 6 parts water, so sort of just so you're getting the same amount of volume there, because that one tends to be less sticky than the other 2. But it will still work if you're at a push. So once you've got that made and this mix made up, you want to be able to cut some newspaper strips. So I've cut some strips of newspaper here, and as you can see, I've kind of made them 1 inch wide and about 6 to 8 inches, maybe a bit longer than that, in length. As I'm going to go along, I'm going to sort of be ripping bits off and just making it fit. And go around and build up this volcano. So it doesn't matter too much how long they are, but I think 1 inch in width works quite well for this type of thing. So what I do is I carefully apply my paper mache glue / flour mixed with water to these paper strips. And you can do that by painting it on, or if you don't mind about getting your hands a bit messy as you're doing it, you can simply just dip it in to the mix and get the paper strip nice and soggy. And what you want to then start doing is layering it on to your bottle and layering it up. So you can see I've almost placed it along the tape to start off with, to act as a bit of support for it. And I'm going to build off of that and build round. Now you'll see I'm going from the bottom to the top of the bottle as I'm building it up. But you can equally, if you like, go around the bottle like that and build it up that way too. And you might want to do a bit of both just to make sure it's stronger and stronger and stronger. So remembering, if you want to make a composite volcano, you want quite steep sides. If you want a cinder cone volcano, you want a cone shape. If you want that shield volcano, you want quite a flat one. So if you were doing a shield volcano, for example, you might want quite a small bottle, so it's got quite a flat curve. And if you're doing a lava dome, you want a dome-like shape for that. So I'm thinking, by the looks of mine here, it's going to probably end up being quite a steep-sided composite volcano. So I'm just adding more and more strips of the newspaper around the side, and it should start to be built up and built up and built up. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole one of making mine, but if you continue with yours, you'll see that it all starts to come together, and you want to continue until there's no gaps. And ideally, you want 2 or 3 layers with no gaps of this newspaper, just to make sure it's nice and strong. And then once you've got that, you leave it to dry. And often it can take a day and a half to dry, and make sure it's fully dry, because that will make it even stronger. Once it's dry, you can then start to paint it. And I'll show you a few that one that in particular that I've painted, and so you can see what the final product is. So I'll show you that after the questions, and sort of get it ready. So if you've got any questions about sort of either making the volcano or any of the content we were talking about before, any question at all, let us know, and you can start typing them in the chat now, and Lawrence will sort of read through them and read out some of the good ones, and hopefully we can get some of those answered. While that's going on, what I'll do as well is I'll put sort of the key points and the things to remember from today's lesson. I'll put them on the screen behind me so you can read through those, and hopefully they'll sort of help jog your memory of any questions you might want to ask. So now if you start typing those questions in the chat, I'll hand over to Lawrence now, and he can read those out for us.
Brilliant, thank you, Jack. I've got a couple of questions saved up already as we wait for people to type them into the chat box. The first is, where is the biggest volcano in the world?
Ooh, so yeah, the biggest volcano in the world. And it's not impressively tall, but it is impressively wide. It's in Hawaii, and you often find a lot of volcanoes in Hawaii, again, because it's near the boundaries of these tectonic plates. It's called Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and it's just impressively flat. And it's that shield type of volcano where it spans a long distance.
Great. Hawaii, it's a good excuse to go to Hawaii. See the biggest volcano in the world. I love it. What's the closest active volcano to us in England?
Oh, good question. The closest active volcano. In terms of active, there's definitely, I would say Iceland. So Iceland's not too far away. And then we had problems with the volcanoes in Iceland. I would say about 10 years ago, 2010, I feel like it was. There's a volcano over there called Eyjafjallajökull, which is hard to say 10 times fast, but that was erupting about 10 years ago, and it's an active volcano. The lava there doesn't tend to be too dangerous. It's quite, the lava that comes out of there is quite slow and thick, so it's not really harming the people there, and it's definitely not harming us. The only problems we had with it is it produced an enormous amount of ash that all blew over the top of England, so we couldn't, the flights were cancelled for a long time between that period. So that's the only real danger we have, danger of not being able to go on holiday because of the volcano in this country. So no real danger here.
Excellent. And a slightly mean question that's come in is, can you spell that Iceland volcano name?
I know it begins with an E, and it will probably have a K in it, but apart from that, no.
Let's move on. Brilliant. So Arthur asks, where is the Mariana Trench? Because we saw that on one of the diagrams earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Mariana Trench is the deepest part of the ocean. It's sort of between Asia and Australia, over that sort of area. It's one of, talking about biology, it's one of the most unexplored regions in the Earth, because we're not on Earth, and the ocean itself is, but this particularly deep part is very unexplored, because up until recently we've not really had the submarines that have been able to deal with the pressure of going down that deep, because as you go deeper and deeper down the Marianas Trench, there's more water above you, so there's more pressure pushing down on your submarine, which of course, if you're deep underwater, you don't want to burst. So we've only recently been able to explore that. So it's a really interesting area to sort of research further after the lesson, the Marianas Trench.
Brilliant. And Sharon asks, are tsunamis caused by underwater tectonic plate movement?
Yes, that's completely right. You've nailed it there. So underwater tectonic plate movement would normally, we know that if they're moving side by side, they normally cause an earthquake. If this happens underwater, it creates vibrations that cause huge waves. Those huge waves are tsunamis that often head towards land, and could cause immense damage, sometimes even be more damaging than an earthquake itself, just because of the huge flood of water.
Brilliant, thank you. And Fiona and Arthur ask, what is the smallest volcano in the world?
The smallest volcano, or you can get some underwater volcanoes that are particularly small, and in fact they're not really volcanoes themselves. They're more like lava vents. They're that small, so it's just a gap between two plates where lava can pour out of, and because they're underwater as well, that lava cools much more quickly. So you'll see a lot of steam coming off of it, but you'll really just see the lava for a few seconds before it turns into a rock and cools down. And that rock is often washed away by the sea, leaving that lava vent just a gap in the ocean floor. So that's as small as they could get, technically.
Brilliant, excellent. And Sunny would like to know if lava dome volcanoes have vents on the top.
Yes, lava dome volcanoes will have a vent on the top. They'll have a crater on the top. They'll also have secondary vents around the outside as well. But yeah, the main one will be on the top normally with a volcano. Yeah. Okay.
And another one, this is from Thomas, can volcanoes blow themselves up?
Blow themselves up? Well, good question. We'll be talking a lot more about that next week, so definitely tune in next week for that answer. But the short answer to that is yes. They can blow themselves up, and the Earth's natural processes and the tectonic plate movements can cause them to sort of produce high pressures that can destroy parts of the volcano. So not obliterate itself, but definitely blow apart chunks of the volcano.
Brilliant. Sounds very exciting and destructive. Why do mountains not have lava like volcanoes do?
Good question. So yeah, the mountains, and we can have mountains that once did have lava and once were volcanoes. They're now dormant volcanoes. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that next week. But the mountains don't have lava because they don't have that vent down the middle that goes down to a magma chamber. So because they don't have that, they don't have the ability to access a magma chamber, so they don't have the ability for that magma to rise up and become lava when it gets to the surface.
Brilliant, fantastic. I think that's all the questions we've had so far, so unless anyone's going to type one in really quickly, I shall hand back to Jack to show the last bits.
So once you've made your volcano and you've sort of added all of the newspaper around the outside, you've got a good solid base that you've left it to dry for a couple of days, what you can do is you can paint it. And that really helps to add to the style of whatever volcano you're going for. So for example, here's one I made earlier. I've sort of painted it a brown-like color with bits of red around the top to show some lava already coming out of this one. I've got some greenery down below like that. And I've sort of gone to paint it all the way around like so. And it's going to be very fun to do once it's dry. And once it's dry as well, you should find that it's quite robust, and a bit more robust than the wet newspaper is as you're putting it on. So that's a good thing to go for. And remember, try and aim for whatever type of volcano you're trying to get, and try and keep to those structures. So sort of if we're going for the cinder cone one, we want this cone-like shape. If we're going for the composite volcano, we want quite steep sides. Again, this one might even be a composite volcano as well. We've got quite steep sides down the side. It's definitely not the next one, which is a shield volcano, very flat. And it's not got that dome-like structure that we would see in a lava dome like that one, but those ones look very, very exciting to make too. And maybe one day I'll try and make one of those ones instead of that one there. So yeah, once you've made it and painted it, definitely get in touch with the Minerva Tutors Twitter, or get your parents to send us an email to show us what you've made, because we'd love to see them. And again, next week we'll be looking at what we can put inside our volcanoes to make sure that we can have to make an eruption, and we'll be talking about how eruptions can happen, sort of some of the biggest eruptions that have ever been, and we'll be looking back at a time, a prehistoric time, when there were a lot more volcanoes and eruptions were a lot more common than they are today as well. So make sure to sort of join us at the same time next week for this second part to this. Once you've got your volcanoes made, either straight after this lesson or the weekend, you should have plenty of time to do it for next week.
We've actually had a couple of late arrival questions come in, so I thought rather than not do them, we take just a couple of minutes now to ask you those final two. So Thomas asks, can a volcano be used for electricity?
So a volcano can be used for electricity, and it's a very, very good source of renewable electricity. We're always looking for renewable forms of electricity, because as a lot of you are probably aware of the global warming crisis that is caused by the current ways we make electricity by burning coal, oil, and natural gas and things like that. So if we could somehow harness the heat of a volcano, we can do this. And places like Iceland do this very, very well. They have what we call geothermal power plants, or electrical power plants, that use the heat from magma chambers underground to heat water to turn a turbine, which turns a generator, which generates electricity. So by using the heat from the magma chamber under the volcanoes, we can create electricity. And it's a very, very clean way of getting electricity. It's a very cheap way. It's a very, very good way, especially for the environment.
Fantastic, brilliant. And Fiona and Arthur, one more question from them. What is your favourite volcano?
Oh, my favourite volcano. I do like Mauna Loa. Just because of on either side of it, it tends to, the ash that's been produced by the volcano is very fertile soil, so it's very good for growing things. And lots of tropical plants grow there, and it makes it look really, really pretty, especially sort of in spring time when all the plants are blooming. So that was one that can be very, very pretty, so I like that one the best.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jack. That's fantastic. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in to watch today, and especially for those who ask questions, because it's great at the end of the sessions to have a really good interactive session with you guys and get your questions answered. As Jack said, next week there'll be a follow-up lesson at 3 p.m. next Wednesday, where we'll be adding the explosive eruptions to the volcanoes. So do make your volcanoes and paint them. Send us pictures if you can between now and then. We'd like to try and reach even more people, so it would be fantastic as well if you could share the sign-up link. It's all completely free, as you know, with any friends, or your parents can share it with other parent friends they have, so we can get even more people coming to the lessons. And finally, one for the parents, we'd be very grateful if any of you out there would give us a Google review. It's a free service that we're providing here, and a lot of work goes into it, and we want to keep it free. So if you can take a couple of minutes just to do a Google review, that would really help us, and of course share it with as many friends as possible, and we'll send a link for the review in the follow-up email as well. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you soon.